The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex.
That was a big ruling from the UK's highest court as they clarify the meaning of the UK's main law when it comes to equality and preventing discrimination. It's left campaigners for women's rights claiming victory and many campaigners for trans people's rights feeling worried. We will explain why and what it means on this episode of the UK's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
Hello, it's Alex in the Westminster studio.
It's James, also in the Newscast studio.
James, you're here as Scotland editor rather than presenter of Newscast.
Because that's your job.
Well, I mean, let's share it around. And also we're joined by Alison Holt, who's the BBC's social affairs editor. Hello again, Alison.
Hello again.
Right, we're going to do the whole episode on this judgment from the Supreme Court today because there's lots to talk about, lots of nuance we can get into as well. And, well, at the heart of it, an 88-page document which quotes lots of other laws which run to lots of other pages. So, James, I think the easiest thing maybe is for you to just take us back to where you think this story begins and just take us through each kind of chapter that led us up to today. And then we can talk about what the judges actually said.
So I have here said 88-page judgment, which I have not read in full yet by any stretch of the imagination, I'm sorry to say. But I was in court, in the Supreme Court, to hear the judgment. And that was quite a moment, but we'll come on to that yet. To go back, Adam, this goes back to the Scottish Government passing a law, the Scottish Parliament passing a law in 2018, which was designed to try to ensure that more women were represented on public boards. And the Scottish Government, in their definition of women, wanted to include trans women. And a long story short, that was challenged by campaigners, the same campaigners who we've seen vindicated in their view in court today. And triumphant, certainly, in court today. And so this has been backwards and forwards, in and out the Scottish courts for a long time. And ultimately, in the end, it ended up in the Supreme Court because the feeling was that there were two conflicting pieces of Westminster legislation here. So the Gender Recognition Act, which is a 2004 act, that's the act that set up the idea of getting a gender recognition certificate and how that could be done. And then the Equality Act 2010, which is a piece of anti-discrimination legislation. And what we've basically got to today is that the Gender Recognition Act says that if you get a gender recognition certificate, it changes your sex for all purposes. And what the judges have said is that when you look at the Equality Act 2010, it says that even transgender people with a gender recognition certificate can still be treated differently. In other words, it seems to conflict. It doesn't seem to be the case that it does change your sex for all purposes if, when it comes to, say, female-only spaces, you're a trans person with a gender recognition certificate and you can potentially, not always, but potentially be excluded. And essentially, the judges have basically sided with the Equality Act here and have said, no, when it comes to the Equality Act, biological sex is what matters, not gender in terms of a gender recognition certificate.
And we'll come to the reactions from outside the Supreme Court in a minute. But it was interesting because I had a bit more time than you because I've not been doing all the news today. So I read a bit more of the judgment. And
do you know, in the taxi on the way here, I was thinking, Adam will have read it.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I hope you don't. Yeah. I didn't read the whole thing. But it's interesting because the judges sort of make it very clear that they feel their job here was just interpreting what the 2010 Equality Act said. They weren't trying to create new law. They weren't trying to change things. They weren't trying to anoint one side of this argument a winner and the other a loser. They were just saying our job here is to make it really clear for everyone who reads this what the Equality Act actually means. And they came based down on the side of what you just said there.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. They were at pains to stress it. Lord Hodge, delivering the judgment, which was unanimous, several times saying trans people are still protected under law in a number of ways. But I must say, Adam, that it didn't feel when he was saying we must counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not. It didn't feel like that either in or outside the court. In the court, it was incredible scenes, really. We were all warned beforehand. This is a court. You must respect the court. Please do not shout, don't call out, be quiet. I don't think that was aimed at the media. I think it was mainly aimed at people who have a vested interest in the case. And people didn't do that, but they could not stifle their gasps. The campaigners who'd been arguing for this position for so long, gasps. And then when the judges left the bench, punching the air, hugging, and people just, some of them really breaking down in tears. It was quite striking, quite a moment.
And actually, by the magic of podcasting, which you now know well, we can illustrate what that was like. So here is Deputy President of the Supreme Court delivering the judgment, as James was just referring to there. This is Lord Hodge.
The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex. But we counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not.
And Alison, just clarify what he was talking about there, and James was nodding to it too. That there's something for, I hate to say both sides here, but the judges were trying to be quite even-handed in their interpretation.
Yeah, well, as James was saying, in the end, what they're doing is they're looking at the wording of the Act itself and saying how that should be interpreted. And under the Act, as well as protections against discrimination and harassment under the sex category, which is in this instance to do with women, there's also a category looking at people who are transgender. So they have protections built into the Act. And that's one of the things the justices were saying very clearly, both in the judgment, but also in what was said in court today.
And Alex, there's something that hasn't changed today, which is that actually under the Equality Act, there was always protection for single-sex spaces, wasn't there?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was listening to Radio 4 and Harriet Harman, the former Labour MP, was on there, and she was talking about the fact that she oversaw that Equality Act as it came into being in 2010. And she was explaining that the way they attempted to design that act was that you were allowed to have single-sex spaces for biological women only, with some caveats around that. But they also attempted to define that act so that there were protections against discrimination for transgender people, exactly as Alison just said. But I think there is a sense, and you talk to a lot of people who've been involved in this debate on various sides, that has become muddy and muddled and open in some cases to interpretation. And so I think a lot of people who have looked at this judgment today have said one thing that it does provide is clarity about exactly what that Equality Act means.
And also, James, this hasn't just come from nowhere, because as you set out, this has been rumbling through the Scottish Parliament and then the Scottish courts for several years. And then I remember at the general election campaign last year, the Conservative campaign was, we will rewrite the Equality Act to clear up all these things. So the things that the court has done today, a British political party was promising to do in a general election campaign last year.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's such an interesting political aspect to this, and obviously Alex will have a more informed view on that than me. But I think to pick up on the point, Adam, she was making there, one of the things that the judges said in their judgment was, sure, there was protection for single-sex spaces before, but they pointed out that you couldn't even ask whether someone had a gender recognition certificate, as that information was private. So if it was a requirement that you must have a gender recognition certificate, and that might change how you were perceived and whether or not you perhaps could access this single-sex space, as someone was trying to ascertain whether or not you could access it. If you couldn't even check whether someone had a certificate, then that was a problem. But that's just an aside. To come back to your point about the politics, I mean, in many ways, Adam, Scotland has been at the front line of the so-called gender wars. You know, we've been having this argument in Scotland for a long time, and the Scottish National Party was really, in many regards, especially under Nicola Sturgeon, the former First Minister, at the forefront of trying to push forward what you might regard as liberalisation of gender laws, certainly in trying to enact the law to make it easier to legally change gender, which was ultimately blocked by Westminster. But then we had a whole series of other controversies as well. Most strikingly, the case of Isla Bryson, a double rapist who was initially housed in a women's prison, which caused outrage. There have been a number of other cases as well. And I think they built up a sense among people not just on the right of politics, but yes, from the Conservatives, but also within the SNP. This very much divided the party, and within the Labour Party. And again, the Labour Party was by no means united on this. At some points, they were in favour. They voted in favour of the attempts to make it easier to legally change gender in Scotland. And Sir Keir Starmer's really changed course since then. But it fed into this idea among critics of what was happening that this was not common sense, and that the common normal understanding of the English language in terms of biological sex was being disregarded by some politicians. Now, obviously, that's hotly disputed by people who are in favour of who take the other approach, and indeed, lots of trans rights groups are extremely distressed, very concerned about this ruling, and very worried about what it's going to mean for them.
And Alex, just talk through the Labour version of that at Westminster, that story that James was just talking about there.
I just think it's been such a... I mean, clearly there are huge implications about this for individuals, but from a purely political perspective, this has been such a thorny issue. And I would say, perhaps in particular from a Westminster perspective for Labour, that question, what is a woman, it was at times repeatedly put to Keir Starmer, and I think it's also fair to say the party's position on this has really shifted. If you cast your mind back a couple of years, when Keir Starmer was asked about this, there were times when there were real kind of like verbal contortions as he tried to settle on a position that wasn't going to alienate anybody, and I think at some points he got himself tied up in a bit of knots around it. And then there's been this sort of evolution where he attempted to really clarify the government's position. And in the Labour manifesto at the last election, they said that they would ensure there was protection for single-sex spaces. And now, in light of this ruling today, we've heard briefings from party sources saying that what Keir Starmer's managed to do is to bring the party to a common sense position. But it's certainly taken a bit of a difficult process for them to get there. And the Conservatives at times have almost attempted to use that, I think, to push Keir Starmer on that question and put that question to him to try to get him to clarify Labour's position on this issue, which has been tricky. But that's not to say that this hasn't been an evolution for the Conservatives as well. They themselves have shifted position in some cases on this. And in fact, every party, the Liberal Democrats, they have some of their own sort of internal battles over this issue. So I think it's, from a political perspective, proved really tricky. And I think from some politicians will look at today's ruling as something that they can now almost lean on and point towards and say, well, look, this is what the Supreme Court has said on this issue. And therefore, that is what we think.
Am I right in saying that at one point, Theresa May proposed gender self-ID?
Well, yeah, let's just clarify what you mean by self-ID first of all.
Okay.
So this is the idea that, because at the moment, to get your gender recognition certificate, you have to go to a panel and prove certain things about your life and what you want to do to get your certificate.
It's a medicalised process.
Yes, but at one point, several people, including, the former Prime Minister, Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, she was quite in favour of the idea of actually stripping away a lot of that process. And people could just kind of do it themselves.
Exactly. And that was the Scottish law that was passed. A similar law was the law we were just talking about that was to make it easier to change gender is the law that was passed at Holyrood and then blocked. But it was just Alex's point that, it's not just Labour that have divisions. It's not just the SNP. Even the Conservatives at one point were saying different things or moving in a different direction.
And individuals within the Conservative Party have taken different positions on this as well. So I think, it has just... and of course, it's also worth saying that the debate around this more broadly hasn't just been the political debate, but the debate around this more broadly has clearly evolved and changed as well. But I think from a political perspective, it's really notable that things have moved.
Inevitably, because of our biases, we've ended up talking about the politics rather than what this might mean in practice for the people who are affected by it. But let's do that now with you, Alison. But before we do that, let's get a bit more reaction from outside the Supreme Court today. We're going to hear now from Susan Smith, who is a campaigner from For Women Scotland, who were the people who were involved in this case. And she gave her reaction as she was drinking some champagne outside court.
We were in a really difficult place in Scotland then. We thought we were going to see rights for women rolled back, and today the judges have said what we always believed to be the case, that women are protected by their biological sex, that sex is real, and that women can now feel safe, that services and spaces designated for women are for women, and we are enormously grateful to the Supreme Court for this ruling.
And then our Radio 4 colleagues on The World at One spoke to Jane Fay, who's director of the advocacy group Transactual UK, who was pretty disappointed by what had just happened.
This is like a physical punch, because what it feels like for pretty much every trans non-binary person in the UK is that you'd like to exclude us wholesale from UK society. So today we're feeling very alone, but I don't want to end it there, because we have come through worse before. We have come through, we have survived, we will survive this, and we will be back stronger than before. I think that's important to understand.
And different people will have different reactions to those reactions themselves. Alison, I mean, it's always hard to theorise about what might happen as a result of a judgment that's literally just come out today, but do you want to give it a go? Yeah, or give us some rules of thumb for how we can think about this.
I have spent quite a lot of today trying to work out exactly what it means, and I think the honest answer to that is it's going to take some time. The Equality Act is now really clear in what it says about, for instance, single-sex spaces. I talked to a lawyer earlier today who said, well, that, it clearly means toilets, changing rooms. It clarifies the situation in sports clubs. But it's really important to say that the existing Equality Act guidance, which I also had a look at today, written in 2022, made the point then that single-sex spaces were for biological women. These are the carve-outs that are contained within the Act. So it's certain sets of circumstances where privacy, I think the phrase is something like privacy, decency and trauma may be issues. That those are reasons where you can have a single-sex space. So to some extent, that is already there. And in certain situations will already be how it is being applied. What I think is probably going to end up happening is a lot of people poring over their gender policies to work out, does this make a difference to it or doesn't it make a difference? So I think, and it's not a very, helpful, insightful answer, but I think it's actually going to take time for us to really work out the impact of this. And then I think there will be there will be broader questions, for instance, about how the Gender Recognition Act now works in tandem with the Equality Act. Again, speaking to a lawyer earlier today, he was very clear that that the Gender Recognition Act is if you like, a private agreement between the state and the individual. The Equality Act is about preventing discrimination against others, and that both women, as biological women, and transgender people have their own separate protections against harassment and discrimination built into the Act, and those still need to be respected. And you have to hope, don't you, with all of this, that the fundamental driver will be people respecting each other and finding a way of working through policies in that way.
And having got to know a bit more about this subject through doing Antisocial on Radio 4, which is actually back on Good Friday at midday. Convenient, although we're doing a different subject this week.
I heard a trail this morning.
Good, thanks for listening. I hope you'll be listening to the actual programme. Of course. I mean, that's been such an instructive process for me, because you realise, okay, Parliament passes a law, and you sometimes think that's the end of the story. It's like, well, no, there's then the courts interpreting the law, because individuals come forward with things, employment tribunals come forward with things, conversations happen on the airwaves, in workplaces, and people interpret some things one way and people interpret other things another way. And that process goes on. It doesn't stop. And actually that process will still continue after today, because this is not the end of it. The courts just provided some guidance, some interpretation, some clarification. Those employment tribunals, those disputes in various workplaces or other places will continue, because this will evolve, because that's what society is. That's what politics and life is.
And one of the things that has been suggested today is that there may be pressure to change, for instance, the Equality Act or the Gender Recognition Act, depending probably on your viewpoint. So laws can change as well. And I think we're at the starting point on this, aren't we?
Yeah, or the middle point.
Middle point, perhaps that's a better place to put it.
Someone said to me today, end of the beginning.
Yeah. And I suppose the big thing, though, that's changed in Scottish politics, though, James, is that Nicola Sturgeon, who was the driver of a lot of this, is out of politics altogether now. And actually, the SNP feels like quite a different party with different priorities. So therefore, the people who would be potentially putting on the table stuff that pushes the boundaries, as some people would see it, that's not happening.
Yes, and also the Greens are no longer in government with the Scottish National Party, and the Greens were very much in favour of a lot of the direction of travel that Nicola Sturgeon took. And John Swinney, the First Minister, who's been in post about a year now, has been very, very keen, made it very clear he just wants to get away from this. He just wants to move on. He doesn't want anything to do with it. As has the Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar, I think, as well. I think they're very much of the mindset that we must just focus on something else. One really tiny point, Adam, in terms of interpretation and what will change and how this might be, this law might end up working out in practice. We do know one very specific thing, which is the original challenge in the first place, which was to this idea of gender balance on boards, public boards of various institutions or whatever in Scotland, that trans women will no longer be counted towards the quota, if you want to call it a quota, of 50%, or trying to get to 50% women on public boards. So there is one, at least, specific, tangible example referenced in this judgment, but that will change.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because if you go through social media today, everyone straight away jumped on like the big picture stuff. And I was like, hang on, are people losing what's actually happened here? Which is, this was a case brought by campaigners who were not happy with something the Scottish Government had introduced. And the Supreme Court today said the Scottish Government was wrong and the campaigners were right. That's the concrete thing that has definitely happened today. And that's the thing you can like hold on to while you're kind of thinking about theorising about what might happen in future. Although, Alex, I just wonder, though, I sometimes wonder if we live in a political world, and today we've dipped our toes into the legal world. And actually, yeah, you go on social media. This hasn't stopped the arguments. In fact, this has emboldened some people to make their arguments even more strongly, and it's made some people feel even more scared than they were before.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody necessarily thought, to James's point, if anything, it's the end of the beginning rather than anything else. You know, I don't think there was anybody that had thought that this might have settled the legal position when it comes to the Equality Act and the consequences, exactly as you mean, for what that original Scottish Government legislation was about, which was about people sitting on public boards. And we don't know the consequences, really, as Alison was explaining, about how this is going to have a real world impact fully yet. But in terms of the arguments, I don't think there was ever any expectation that it would settle or finish the arguments, no matter what the plea from the court was about, this isn't about winners or losers. I think there will definitely be some people that feel like they've either won or lost as a consequence of the decision today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, you three, for making that very clear. And the great thing is, though, like, you can go on the Supreme Court website, and if you want to read all 88 pages, they're there, and they write these documents pretty well. So there's all sorts of references to other bits, and they tell you where to go and find the other bits.
I'm with James. Like, I knew you would have read them all. I just knew
I have
it.
an easy life compared to you guys.
The Supreme Court is actually a pleasure to work in, I have to say. It's so open, it's so easy. You get good documents, you get good access. I'll give them that.
And that is no comment on judges and where the role they play in society and whether people are happy or not with that. That's a whole other episode about how justice works. Now, talking about other episodes, so I've been beavering away this week on a little special set of newscasts for the Easter weekend, which we're calling Old Newscast. And basically the concept is we're doing episodes of Newscast, not quite as if there were on other days in recent political history, but kind of looking at other big moments in our recent history and doing an episode of Newscast with people who were either there or real experts on it, and just doing all the classic newscast thing of like digging into the documents and like talking about the arguments and looking a bit at the context. And so we will be rolling them out from Friday. And do you want to know what the 2 days we're looking at are?
I know what one of them is, because last week when I was here, everyone was working hard on it. A wonderful newscast team were working very hard on it,
Yes.
Adam. In your absence, you'll be pleased to hear.
Good. Thanks for keeping an eye on them. Yeah, so on Friday and Saturday, we will drop 2 episodes about the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland, or contributed to peace in Northern Ireland. And then on Easter Sunday and Monday, you will hear an episode about the collapse of Lehman Brothers and why that was such a crucial moment in the global financial crisis.
Interesting.
Be tuning in.
Great idea.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Well, I mean, wait till you hear them. Wait till you hear them. I mean, they've been so interesting to do. And it is interesting just like taking like what we've done today, but then just applying it to a day when Newscast didn't exist. And you just realise, back to my point about, oh, this is the middle, or your point about this is the end of the beginning. It's like...
We'll all be coming to you with suggestions of what you can do next.
Please do. Well, no, be my
There are
be
so
my
many
guest.
days in history that it would be great to look at.
Yeah, and also I think it's good to do kind of history that's recent but not ancient. Like, we don't want to do like the Suez Crisis, I don't think, because that's for historians. But
Fall of the Roman Empire.
Well,
I was thinking that.
can you imagine? We'll do that in togas. Would you wear a toga for that episode, James?
Sure, if you require it.
Right. I'm glad we required your presence today because it's been very helpful. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Nice to see you, Adam.
And thank you, Alex.
Pleasure as ever.
And we'll be back with another episode of Newscast very soon. And then we will be dropping those special old newscasts for you to listen to. Bye-bye.